All right, everybody, thanks again for joining us. This panel is C. diff Advocacy Across Sectors. My name is Lynn Vachon, and I'm the Director of Policy and Practice for the Society for Healthcare Epidemiology of America. We're going to go through here with our panel to give sort of a background. I'm actually going to start here, and then we'll go across, and then I will close out that part of our introduction so that we can kind of segue into our next topic. So we'll start with you.
This is just a who I am deal?
Yes, yes.
Okay. So my name is Larry Brandt. I'm a gastroenterologist in New York, in the Bronx, New York. And I've been there since 1974. And I do a lot of clinical teaching. That's my primary responsibility. But I also take care of patients. And although most of my early years were done in vascular diseases of the gut, a sick patient caused me to come up with a different form of therapy for C. diff, and I came up with a fecal transplant, and I did my first fecal transplant in 1990, and since then I've probably done between 350 and maybe 450 cases, mainly for C. diff, but also for inflammatory bowel disease and irritable bowel syndrome. And if there are any pressing questions about me, I will speak longer, but otherwise I'm going to give the microphone away.
Thank you. My name is Christopher Decosta, or just Chris. I am an infectious disease physician by training, but work predominantly now in the biotechnology industry. 90% of the time I have a small practice, 10% of the time. And my interest in C. diff actually goes back many years when I trained in the United Kingdom in Wales. And it's sort of come full circle because now I actually work on trying to develop a new, I wouldn't call it exactly a therapy, but a prevention of C. diff, something that's a totally different paradigm. But it is a drug, and we probably can talk more about that later on. I work for a company called Synthetic Biologics, where I'm VP of Clinical Development, and we're based in the Rockville, Maryland area.
Hello, my name's Katherine Dupree. I am primarily a grandmother of number 8 on the way, but I got into this realm because I had C. diff 8 times between 2005 and 2012, and my professional background is of a medical case manager with a master's degree specifically in rehabilitation counseling, working with patients who had experienced disability or injury or trauma, and then I found myself in that situation, so it's kind of ironic. But the last 2 times I had C. diff were in 2012, and I had already had 2/3 of my colon removed from previous episodes, and I had a team of 6 doctors at this point in Indianapolis. And they got their heads together and said, we have nothing left to offer you, and we don't think you would survive colectomy. So we think it's time for you to call your family in and say your goodbyes. And this is because I was going into renal failure from severe dehydration and had developed tachycardia from dehydration. Very sick. So I am the mother to 3 wonderful daughters, and they went into overdrive. One's a doctor, one's an attorney, and one's an economic analyst. They're all brilliant researchers. And at that time, you could not identify any providers in the United States of fecal transplant. But they found out about it and found out that Thomas Perotti in Australia was doing it for recurrent C. diff. So we printed out all this information. My husband brought it to the hospital. Only 2 of my 6 doctors had ever heard of it. None of them would do it. So I discharged myself against medical advice and went home, and my husband and I did it at home, and it saved my life. And I became obsessed with the idea that at least 30,000, probably double or triple or quadruple that, are dying every year, and at that time, probably none of them had ever heard of fecal transplant. So I decided to start the Fecal Transplant Foundation. Larry was one of our first board members. And by sheer coincidence, my very first involvement was at a meeting of the FDA where they were going to decide that physicians could no longer perform fecal transplant even for C. diff. And I started crying to the moderator, said I needed to speak. I did. I was a little bit more nervous than I am right now, but I told my story, and 6 weeks later they reversed their opinion and decided that they would allow doctors to do it for recurrent C. diff. So I think that in itself has saved countless lives, but now we're involved in so many areas of this, C. diff still being the basis, kind of, because that was where my involvement came from, but we work with now the CDC and NIH and FDA and all kinds of groups and doing all kinds of things on all kinds of fronts, and there's just so much to be done and not enough people to do it. So I'm a lay person. I'm not a scientist. I'm not a doctor, but I know a lot about fecal transplant and C. diff.
Hi, I'm Paul Alper. I wear two hats. I am chairman of a nonprofit organization, the Electronic Hand Hygiene Compliance Organization, and we're focused on changing the standards for how hand hygiene is measured and how staff are given feedback to improve, working with accreditation organizations, government agencies, and regulators and hospitals. And I wear another hat, and it's Vice President of Patient Safety for one of the technology companies, one of the members of ECHO, DebMed. And I want to thank Christian for joining our advisory board and for having us here today. I'm pretty honored to share some ideas and science and evidence and hopefully enlighten some of you and maybe energize and maybe anger and provoke some of you to action. Because when you hear the story of the state of hand hygiene today in U.S. healthcare, it's pretty scary. And again, thank you very much for having us here.
So that was great background and sort of sets the tone for the topic of this panel, which is exploring how different representative groups, so you've got your patient advocates, your physicians, and by the way, I represent physicians, primarily healthcare epidemiologists, many of whom are researchers in healthcare-associated infections. Shay's mission is to get healthcare-associated infections to zero infections, and we promote judicious use of antibiotics, and we are champions of antibiotic stewardship. So with that background, and as you can see, this is a very diverse panel of sort of experts in our own way in C. difficile. How do we then all work together as partners on a shared mission, on a shared goal, on advocating for policy change to get to zero infections, so get to zero C. diff infections? So we'll start here with Dr. Brandt on asking when you think of advocacy and the advocacy that you've engaged in, what does advocacy mean to you from your perspective? Because advocacy means different things to different people, especially in the approach and your shared mission. And so oftentimes when we choose our collaborative partners, it's understanding what that means to us. So we'll start with you.
Well, I guess I have a narrow concept of advocacy from my own perspective, because I look at the word as meaning one who is a spokesman for someone else. So the people that I speak for are my patients. Now, I can do that in several ways. I guess the most intimate form of advocacy that I have is with my patient. Because when you're one-on-one talking to a patient, you're really representing them and you're trying to do the best thing for them. They may not even know that you're on their side because they may want something else done and you know that's not the right thing to do. So in that kind of intimate advocacy role, it's your job to give the patient the best representation as a physician and as the manager of that person's care. Well, where do patients get cared for? Well, in my situation, they get cared for in the hospital. So my next role as a patient advocate is to bring to the hospital administration, as difficult or as easy as it is, the things that are needed to advance the care of the disease that that particular patient has, thereby helping that patient. And for C. difficile, that has to do with hygiene measures, the proper way to clean a room, and we work very closely with our healthcare representatives who are much more expert in that than I am. My expertise stops at the patient's door. It doesn't, I'm not involved with the room, but there's a lot of science, as some of the people on this panel know far better than I do, in terms of what's the best way to kill the bug, okay? So, but the hospital has to understand that sometimes it's important to spend more, not less, because ultimately, if these patients survive, don't get recurrent disease, and don't get readmitted to the hospital, it's going to wind up driving down costs, not increasing costs. And then we step outside of the hospital, and we extend our advocacy a little more, and I do a lot of lecturing at national and international meetings on many things, but C. diff in particular for today. Well, when you do that, and you teach other physicians the right way to do things, or to point out the wrong way to do things, you're acting as that patient's advocate. So I think most of my advocacy work is done in a political arena in the hospital and an educational arena outside the hospital.
For me, advocacy means a number of things. I think first and foremost, it means knowing who the most important stakeholder is and keeping an eye on that stakeholder, and that is the patient. And it's very important, I think I say this, being someone who works in the biotechnology and pharmaceutical industry, because often what the public perception is that industry loses sight of the patient and has their focus on the profits. But it's very important, and I think this is true of most physicians in industry, is that we have the patient in mind first, and that's why we go into industry. We're concerned about patient safety, but in this case, the advocacy comes in where we actually try to introduce a new paradigm or new methods or different ways of supporting the preventative efforts for C. diff. So you'll hear about, I'm sure, more about antibiotic stewardship. You've heard a little bit about it. You've heard about a little bit about drugs for C. diff. But where we come in specifically in our company is to try to develop a drug that actually prevents you from getting C. diff in the very first place. And we can certainly talk more about that, if you have specific questions of the mechanism of action. The issue there is it's a completely new paradigm, and what it means is that the regulators, the regulatory authorities, the FDA, the EMA in Europe, various authorities in various countries, because this is a global problem, have to be educated. They have to be made aware of the fact that this is a drug that shouldn't be treated as a drug traditionally is in the first place, because really, in a sense, it's more akin to a vaccine than a drug because it's preventing disease. And that's not something that the sort of well-oiled machinery is attuned to. So we have to be really prepared to take a different strategic approach to dealing with regulators so they understand what this new preventative drug is all about. So that's one very important part of advocacy. The other is working with the likes of the CDC, which I have to say have been very, very, very understanding and supportive of us, to send the message out, to help us to spread the message that, along is coming a very new form of prevention, and it should be complementary to what's being done already, to stewardship, hand washing, and other measures. It's not going to supplant these measures. I think those measures are the foundation of helping to reduce the incidence of disease and the prevalence of disease, but this is going to be part of the jigsaw puzzle. So
advocacy with the CDC, I think, and such organizations, similar organizations in other countries, other parts of the world, I think is also very important. The last point I'll make is about really looking within in industry and looking at some of the recent issues that pertain to pricing of drugs. That, you know, is another issue that really has put a stain on biotechnology and pharmaceutical companies. And one of the things that we aim to do is, again, to put the patient first and to really develop a drug that is going to cost pennies on the pound. That is not going to be a concern to the government, Medicare, Medicaid, when it comes to paying for it, insurance companies and so on. This is a very big issue with new drugs, as you know, being developed, newer technologies, which are very highly priced and in many cases don't get to the patient for that reason. So that's another form of advocacy, to convince industry that it's a different approach here. We're going to develop something that really is going to be accessible in terms of cost. And those are the different things I think about in terms of advocacy.
We're going to end up with all the microphones over here. Here you go.
Yeah, oh, thank you.
Yeah. Advocacy for me means so many different things. The mission statement of the foundation is to provide education to patients and physicians in the scientific community, to raise awareness in those populations and the general public, and to advocate, we specifically use that word, advocate for patients and for the science of FMT. Now, as Larry probably better than anyone knows here, the science is evolving so rapidly. 2 years ago, I was appointed to an NIH group started out being called the FMT Working Group. And before we ever had our first meeting, the name was changed to the MT Working Group, Microbiota Transplantation. And we were tasked over a period of 2 years with meeting every 3 months to develop a legal framework for the FDA to use for all microbiome transplantation going forward, fecal, oral, vaginal, skin, and nasal. And as some of you might have seen, the first product, an oral microbiome product, was approved yesterday for periodontal disease using a microbiome transplant from patients with no periodontal disease, and it's shown great success. So, you know, right now on my phone, I have 14,000 unread emails from patients, almost all of them. The website's getting 1 million hits a month from patients all over the world. We maintain a global database of not just physicians in the United States, but all the physicians and all the clinics all over the world that are doing microbiota transplantation. And as you probably know, it's still only allowed in the U.S. for recurrent C. diff not responding to standard antibiotic therapy unless it's within an approved clinical trial. And as of about an hour ago, there were 155 clinical trials going on for fecal transplant. Some of these are C. diff, but they range from fatty liver disease to metabolic disorders to inflammatory bowel disease, depression, anxiety, neurological conditions, oncology. Quite by accident, oncologists found out, you know, you're given chemo, it suppresses your immune system, you develop a secondary infection. Sometimes after you're given antibiotics for that, you develop C. diff, and quite by accident, they found out that the patients that they were treating for these infections for C. diff with fecal transplant all of a sudden had a much better response to their chemotherapy. So now we've got psychiatrists, oncologists, radiologists, anybody you can think of all over the world wanting to know how to do this, how to start a program, what they need to do. The problem here in the United States is lack of providers. When I started the foundation, as I said, there were no identifiable providers in the United States on the internet. Now there are almost 500 providers that we know of in the United States. But if the number of 500,000 cases a year is correct, approximately 20 to 30% of those now are not responding to antibiotics, which is a huge increase just in the last 5 years. that means 150,000 people a year alone with C. diff could benefit from fecal transplant, and we would need about 1,500 providers to meet that need if they were doing fecal transplant 7 days a week, 24 hours a day. So a lot of what we do is try to help hospital systems go through the process of starting a program. There's a lot of uncertainty right now with the FDA language. People think that the draft guidance that was issued saying stool banks shouldn't be used, they think that was implemented, which it wasn't. So a lot of doctors are requiring their patients to find their own donor, which is terribly burdensome and expensive. Only 2.86% of people who think they will qualify as a fecal donor actually pass all of the blood and stool testing. So theoretically, that means you could test 97 people before you found a donor. And when we had my husband tested, it was $5,000 out of pocket. So those are the kinds of issues that we advocate for. A lot of it is cost. The FDA is still tagging this as an experimental procedure. And so if the doctors use the code that was assigned, it's often getting denied because they are under no obligation, payers are under no obligation to pay for experimental procedures. In 1 year alone, when I was on vancomycin for 9 months that year, my insurance company, which is TRICARE, my husband's retired military, 22 years, my insurance company paid $275,000 for my vancomycin that year, and yet the next year they wouldn't approve $1,200 for a colonoscopy for an FMT. And when I contacted the 7 major insurance companies in the United States, none of them would say this on the record. Off the record, all 7 of them said, we have no interest in keeping our costs down because then we can't justify raising our premiums. So those are the kind of things that we're involved in, advocacy, and a lot of it is education and raising awareness. Our biggest problem right now is, I don't know about here, but in Kentucky where I'm from and Indiana where I live, once you're admitted to a hospital, you're generally, your specialist gives up oversight of your care and you're treated by a hospitalist who are wonderful people, I'm sure, but jacks of all trades and not interested in experimental treatments. So I've had 2 friends personally in the last 5 years die from C. diff who were never offered a fecal transplant, even though the one study that was done on terminal, basically, C. diff, 75% of the people that were given a fecal transplant after they had experienced multiple organ shutdown lived. So we have so many things to advocate for, and we just kind of put out fires all the time.
Chris, I agree with you that it's got to start with a patient, and in terms of the work that we do with our organization, it really does start there, and we have to ask ourselves, why are we doing what we're doing? Why did ECHO form? Why did 10 competing technology companies decide to get together and put aside commercial interests and really focus on the patient safety and public health issue? Because we still don't have hand hygiene right in healthcare today. Setting a little historical context, I was privileged to have launched Purell back in the 80s and 90s, and when I walked in with alcohol and the reams of data that were available from Europe, people like Manfred Rotter in Austria and such, I got laughed at. They said, no, we'll never use that stuff. We wash with soap and water. And of course, it became the standard of care. And I think we're at the same threshold today where the electronic, accurate, and reliable and validated measurement of a critical measure of healthcare quality and patient safety, hand hygiene, is that next disruptive change. And so I think it's important that we have that historical concept. It's also a construct. It's also important to recognize that we still don't have it right. This is the 170th anniversary of Semmelweis. And for those of you who may not be familiar with Semmelweis, he was an Austrian physician who proved that if you, he saw a lot of women dying in childbirth from sepsis, and so he noticed that the physicians were the ones whose patients were dying, and they were going directly to the patients from the morgue. So he, before Lister and before Pasteur, had them wash their hands in a solution of chlorinated lime. You think Purella's tough or those sanitizers are tough. Imagine chlorinated lime. And he reduced the sepsis deaths by 75%, and they threw him out, they denied the data, and he died in an insane asylum. So we've known for 170 years, but we still don't have it right. Hand hygiene rates today are estimated by the CDC to be no more than 50%. And when they're measured accurately and reliably, we know studies, Niall, who's here, his equipment was used in a very, very important study in Canada, demonstrating that it was only 30% when it was measured electronically and accurately and reliably. So the fact is, if you're a patient, you've got a 1 in 2 or 1 in 3 chance that they're going to do hand hygiene and a 2 in 3 chance that they're probably not going to do it properly. And it's so important with C. diff because you've got to shift behavior from alcohol to soap and water because you've got to wash the spores off the hands. And how are you going to measure that with the observers that they're using? And that's the other piece that today has got to change, and where advocacy is going to be extremely important. And that is, if we think about how we measure hand hygiene today, the quote-unquote so-called gold standard is the secret shopper or the person or direct observer. Some hospitals use secret shoppers, some use people who are known. The different approaches, but it's human observation that captures a fraction of the number of hand hygiene events that take place. And people behave differently when they're being watched, when they know that they figure out who's doing the observation. It's like when you see the radar on the side of the road, you slow down, and it's the same thing. It's called the Hawthorne effect. And it's been proven in multiple studies that rates are dramatically inflated. So if you don't have accurate data, how are you possibly going to give feedback? And so these secret shoppers see somebody not doing hand hygiene. When we think about the concept of the secret shopper, they see somebody not do hand hygiene and don't do anything about it. They mark it down, non-compliant, because they're the quote-unquote secret shopper, but they allow somebody to then do care. I mean, that really borders on the unethical. And I just think that's something that we'll look back and say, oh, we allowed smoking in break rooms and we allowed secret shoppers. It's going to be in that type of construct. So where does this all net down for advocacy? It's important now for us as an organization, now that science is emerging, now that evidence is emerging. There's a couple of papers over there that I left, one that was just published this month demonstrating reduction of C. diff using electronic measurement and feedback to healthcare workers on soap versus sanitizer use, 66% reduction in C. diff rates in a major teaching hospital. So it's really important now that we as an organization become stewards of the science, stewards of the evidence, stewards of the studies that are emerging, and bring that to the CDC, to CMS, to CMMI, which is the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Innovation, to the Joint Commission, to DNV, the accreditation, the people who say that the hospitals are accredited and able to meet the conditions for participation of CMS, and Shay and IDSA and all these organizations. So that's what we're doing. We're beginning that process of bringing the science and educating, both at the organization, the influential organization level, those that I just referred to, and also at the hospital level, at the provider level. Because I've been to meetings, and I'm sitting next to a CMO in Chicago, and he said, "What do you do?" And I explained. He said, "Oh, there's another way to measure hand hygiene besides secret shoppers. It's a brand new emerging category. The science has begun to evolve over the last 10 years, and the technology has developed, but it's only within the past few years that the outcomes evidence is being published. And so it's really important for us as an organization to bring the science to the influential organizations so that they can give guidance to the hospitals, hopefully start to change the guidelines and the standards, bring it to legislators, and also bring it to the hospitals, to the C-suite, to the leadership in patient safety and quality, and make sure that they understand the science so they can make intelligent decisions about the adoption of technology and assess whether or not, as a lot of my colleagues have said, is the juice worth the squeeze? And the fact is the science is emerging that says yes, and it will make a difference in patient safety, and it will make a difference in the way certainly diseases like C. diff are prevented, because you can give real-time feedback to staff when C. diff is identified and tell them whether or not they're washing with soap and water or alcohol. And if they're not doing it properly, give real-time feedback in a way that disrupts the chance for harm.
Well, that was great, and thanks everybody for your background. So As we sort of segue into our discussion about what our challenges are, I just want to touch a little bit on what Shay does. So as I mentioned earlier, Shay is a professional organization for healthcare epidemiologists. We are primarily physicians. Some of us, not typically full-time, but some of our members do engage in patient care, but primarily our job is to conduct surveillance, collect data and information at the facility level and sometimes at the regional level on the prevalence of healthcare-associated infections that occur in healthcare facilities, primarily hospitals, but certainly, as Dr. Cosgrove pointed out earlier, moving more and more into long-term care and into other settings. As I mentioned earlier, our goal is to get to 0 healthcare-associated infections. We are a subspecialty of a specialty profession. Our organization is approximately 2,000 members, and that's not all physicians. We also have pharmacist members, we have infection preventionists, and a variety of other epidemiologists. And as I'm sure you can imagine, as a professional organization, 2,000 members is on the very low side. There are other nonprofit organizations that are tens of thousands, maybe even hundreds of thousands, and oftentimes those organizations, when they're trying to influence policy, whether it's on Capitol Hill or at the state level or even at the facility level, they can be highly influential just by sheer numbers. But for an organization like Shay, we can't be successful without partnerships and collaborations. Our goal then at the sort of organizational level is not to influence policy by sheer numbers, but to harness our expertise among our members. So we have scientists and medical professionals who are a wealth of information. And my job as the Director of Policy and Practice is to use that information meaningfully and connect them with policy influencers. So that's going to be lawmakers on Capitol Hill. It may be executives in the C-suite within their hospitals or within their facilities. But in order for me to be successful in doing that, I have to connect with people like you in the room. So with organizations like the Peggy Lillis Foundation, with other professional societies like IDSA. In fact, we share office space with IDSA, other organizations that represent the infection prevention community. But where it's most critical is connecting with patients and patient advocates. And by the nature of the practice of healthcare epidemiology, where they're not engaged with patient care, it is very difficult for us to actually identify patient advocate partners at the local level. I can talk to Christian, he runs an organization, but how do I connect Dr. Cosgrove with a patient that's in Maryland or maybe even in her own facility, simply because there's not that day-to-day opportunity to connect with them. So that in and of itself is an example of one of our challenges. And so we have to be creative in thinking about how we make those connections. And then I think one of the most important takeaways from today's summit is education between both of the sort of different types of advocacy groups. So one of the things that we were talking about offline is understanding your language as a patient advocate. We know that from the physician perspective, we can be very technical and clinical in our language. I'm not a clinician, but even I get immersed in it, and then I begin sort of speaking the speak, and then next thing you know, I'm speaking in all acronyms, and it's all Greek, and I don't even know what I'm saying maybe half the time. But it is critical that we understand the patient's perspective in your language, because I need to learn how to speak it. And then in exchange, when we have that opportunity to be in front of policymakers, to influence and sort of push the needle in the right direction, it's your stories, your experiences from your perspective in your language that is the most impactful. And as we view it, as the physicians, as the researchers, we are there to be your champions, to provide the data, the expertise, the understanding, the science, to push it the extra mile. So that's sort of our challenge, but then our goals kind of in a nutshell.
Why are you giving me the microphone?
Oh. What are your challenges as you're advocating and as you're identifying partners and what are the challenges that you encounter along the way?
You know, the challenges are, I think, perhaps no different for C. diff than for any other disease. When you come up with a new therapy, or you come up with something that has not been accepted yet, and you sort of get the feeling that the salmon get when they're swimming upstream, that you have to convince a lot of people. And sometimes you have things that are making it difficult for you that are operating behind the scenes unknown to you. For example, keeping your budget high rather than keeping your budget low. Not something anyone would intuit because it makes no sense, in a sense. So I think the major challenge is to identify the people who are responsible for decision making and convince them that you're right. And the way to do that is it's like fundraising. When you fundraise, a successful fundraiser is one who has the ability to find what is important to the person he or she wants to donate. If you can make that connection, you'll get your money. And if you can't, and you can give that person a very eloquently written speech and deliver it quite beautifully, if you don't make the personal connection, you're just not going to do it. So I think getting the job done involves a lot of things. It involves luck, it involves knowledge, it involves skill, it involves interpersonal relationships. Sometimes it involves money.
I would say the challenges from our perspective pretty formidable. And I'd say the first one that comes to mind is the fact that the microbiome, as we know it is now, it's sort of a buzzword now, relatively new in the sort of arena of medicine and drug discovery. And there isn't a great deal of belief, I think, in the microbiome outside medical scientific circles, not as great as we'd like it to be at this point in time. So it's an uphill battle convincing people that, hey, here's a normal flora that everyone has in their gut. And because of disruption of this normal flora, we are prone to emergence of bacteria that then establish themselves, produce toxins, and cause disease that is such as C. diff. So we are seeing, from our perspective, that even within the scientific community, it's a challenge to convince all the powers that be and stakeholders that the microbiome is a real thing. And our drug is predicated on the whole concept of the microbiome. But it's changing. It's getting better and better. The more we go to meetings, I just came from a meeting in Europe, and there's a lot more belief, I would say, than in the US. But as we spread the word around, things are gradually falling into place. So that has a very big impact on our funding, which is the second issue we have. As a small biotech company, we're not a big GSK or Merck or Pfizer, which has deep pockets. And we rely a lot on venture capital and various sources of funding that are non-traditional. In the current economic and political climate, there is less of a tendency to throw the hand in the pocket and dish out money. So we are having to convince these people that the microbiome is a real thing, and that's even harder. They're used to more traditional drug development. Oncology is a low, hanging fruit. It's very easy, so much easier. People understand cancer. It's life-threatening. It's pretty ghastly. People don't quite understand C. diff in that same context as well. So it's financially, raising funds has been a challenge for a small biotech company such as ours. But we are getting some help, from the likes of BARDA. You probably know about, government sources with their various programs.
We do have some venture capitalists that are warming to our concept. And eventually, we hope that this is going to get better. But it is a huge challenge to raise the necessary funds to conduct all the studies that we want to conduct.
So we're actually running out of time. I apologize. We're going to have to kind of wrap up the panel discussion, but we'd like to go ahead and open up the floor to questions or comments from anyone in the audience.
Hi, Niall Wallace. And to the moderator, I think one of the challenges you identified, or you're heavy into the data, and I think one of the challenges that's been identified by Stanford Business School, Harvard, numerous organizations, is the quality of the data and the possible gaming of data that's being done at the hospitals because of the implications on reimbursement and the financial penalties. How do we get an accurate picture of the problem if we can't trust the data that's coming directly from the providers?
So that's an excellent question. I don't know that I have the answer for that, but some of the discussion that we've had among our members has to do with validating the data that's been reported and the fact that there's not, there really is no standard mechanism for doing that, and it can be very expensive. My understanding, and I don't know if others can correct me, that a hospital that is collecting that data and reporting that can voluntarily have that audited and validated, but at their own expense, and it's very expensive. So right now, that's not a component of the data collection and surveillance function. As some of our other panelists have mentioned, at the end of the day, that comes down to funding. And so, one of the things that we spend the most time on is advocating for federal funding to support these functions. As we've talked about earlier already, probably in every panel, that's at very serious risk. I won't go off on a tangent right now, but it's not going to get better if it's going to get worse first. So, infrastructure funding to make that happen.
You raise a very good point that's spot on, and I think that maybe one of some of the good news that might be inside there in the U.S. With the new HAC penalty, the hospital-associated condition penalty, where hospitals in the lowest 25% will pay 1% penalty of all their CMS revenue. At least they're all being measured the same way, accurate, reliable, to be determined, but it's a level playing field for all the hospitals. And so, and the good news regarding C. diff is, as of 2017, the weighting of how that score is made up, C. diff and MRSA were added, and the shift was 85% toward infection. So the way the hospital-associated condition penalty is made up, 85% of the scoring is based on the infections, CLABSI, CAUTI, SSIs, MRSA, and C. diff. So with that going in there, and that kicked in January 1st of this year. As of January 1st this year, hospitals who were in the bottom 25%, including their C. diff score, are losing 1% of their revenue. And when you see, if you look at the database and you see the hospitals that are at the top of the list for highest penalty, you'll be shocked at some of the most major teaching hospitals. I'm not going to mention names, but if you take a look at the database, you'll absolutely be shocked. So the fact that it's a level playing field might drive behavior, because it's a situation where every hospital has to improve. It's not just improving on their own. They have to improve against everybody else, because they don't want to end up in the bottom 25% again, even having made gains. So I think that the good news is it might spur gains, even though we may not have good data. At least the HAC penalty, assuming it stays in place under the new administration, which hopefully it will, is going to will hopefully make a difference in quality and outcomes, which is, at the end of the day, all we care about, is what's happening for the patient.
Are there any more questions? We're really at the end. Yes, go ahead.
How far are we away from the fecal transplant, from experimental to mainstream, where it's going to be covered by insurance?
Well,
Yeah, it's on.
that's kind of changing daily and regionally. There are several insurance companies now that will reimburse. I probably shouldn't admit this, especially on camera, but we advise doctors to use the billing code for a regular screening colonoscopy with a modifier, like if you were doing a biopsy on a polyp, to handle the additional cost of handling the fecal transplant material. And that more often than not guarantees reimbursement. The CMS reimbursement for a fecal transplant is $135 right now. It was as of last year, which, the average cost of a colonoscopy is about $1,200. The good news is there's only 1% of difference in effectiveness between colonoscopy and enema. And enema can be done by a nurse at a much lower cost. That's not happening a lot, but it should be. But we are working every day to try to get that experimental tag removed. Also, there's no recourse for a patient right now if they're not offered a fecal transplant. No one can be held liable for not offering an experimental procedure, which is a problem. And, the other issue is fecal transplant is not just efficacious with C. diff, it's shown efficacy with CRE and VRE and MRSA. And so we spoke last year at PACCARB, Presidential Advisory Committee Combating Antibiotic-Resistant Bacteria. I spoke on fecal transplant as a novel, non-antibiotic therapeutic for antibiotic-resistant infections. I'm all for antibiotics. They save lives every day, but the problem is any new antibiotic is going to develop resistance against it quickly. I don't know if you're familiar with the viral YouTube video that went out last year. I think it originated on BuzzFeed or something. Then the New York Times picked it up, and bacteria now, when introduced to a new antibiotic, develops resistance in 11 days on average. So we need to start thinking about fecal transplant as much more than a treatment for C. diff.
All right, thank you, everyone. Move on.